after this probably means after the fulfillment of the judgments on Israel prophesied by Amos. Then God would return and do a work of restoration. Also, James apparently took the Lord's promise to rebuild David's fallen tent as parallel to Isaiah's prophecy that the Messiah would come as a shoot or branch out of the stump of Jesse and the root of David. Though David's glory would be gone and his kingdom fallen, God would raise up the Messiah from among David's descendants and restore the hope not only of Israel, but also the Gentiles who would accept the Messiah and become part of God's people. It was always God's plan to include Gentiles in the church. Verse 19 says, "It is my judgment, therefore, that we should not make it difficult for the Gentiles who are turning to God. Instead, we should write to them, telling them to abstain from food polluted by idols, from sexual immorality, from the meat of strangled animals, and from blood. For Moses has been preached in every city from the earliest of times, and is read in the synagogue on every Sabbath day." Gentile believers were turning to God, and the Spirit's message of wisdom was that the Jewish believers should not make it difficult for them by adding a further requirement to their faith. They wrote a letter to them directing the Gentile believers to keep away from food polluted by idols, that is, everything connected with idol worship, which would include meat offered to idols. The Gentiles should not retain anything of their former idol worship, not even as family heirlooms. Even though they now knew these things were meaningless and harmless, their idolatrous neighbors could misinterpret this and suppose that worship of God could be mixed with pagan worship or pagan ideas. They were to refrain from sexual immorality. These Gentiles came from a background where immorality was accepted, even encouraged, often in the name of religion. It took considerable teaching to make them realize that the things everyone else were doing were wrong. In several of Paul's letters, he had to deal very, very sternly with the problems of immorality. They were to refrain from the meat of strangled animals, which meant killed in an unkosher manner without draining the blood, and from blood or drinking blood. Observing these things was to be expected of the Gentiles, not to put them under a burden or a list of rules, but rather for the sake of promoting fellowship with the Jewish believers. Table fellowship was very important in the early church. If there was anything that would nauseate a Jewish believer, it was the thought of eating meat that had not been bled, or to eat blood itself. If the Jewish believers were going to accept non-kosher foods in Gentile believers' homes, then the least Gentile believers could do was avoid serving or eating these things, which no Jew, no matter how long he had been a Christian, could tolerate. The Gentiles were to compromise. They were asked, as a matter of love, not salvation, to refrain from making a show of their liberty in areas where Jewish believers had question of conscience. It was a matter of promoting unity. This letter was delivered and read to the church in Antioch, and all the people were glad for its encouraging message.
Faithful, forever you are faithful, Father.